In a small, forgotten village nestled deep within the misty woods, there were a tale parents whispered to their children to keep them obedient. A story about a doll. Not just any doll, but one made of porcelain so fine it gleamed like moonlight, with eyes that shimmered unnervingly lifelike. Its name had long been forgotten, but everyone knew it simply as *the walking doll star. This doll wasn't displayed in a shop window or perched innocently in a child's room. No, it resided in an ancient, crumbling manor at the edge of the forest. The house, overrun by ivy and shadow, was said to hum with an eerie tune on moonless nights. The villagers spoke of strange occurrences, footprints in the mud leading away from the manor, distant, childlike laughter echoing in the dead of night, and worst of all, stories of people disappearing after hearing faint tapping on their windows. They all knew the legend. Once the doll chose you, it would follow. First, it would appear in your home, perhaps on a shelf or sitting at the edge of your bed. No matter where you moved it, or how far you threw it away, it would always find its way back. At first, it was still, just watching. But as the days passed, it would begin to move. The doll's movements were subtle at first, a tilt of the head, a shift of its legs. But then it would grow bolder. The sound of tiny porcelain feet scuttling across the floor in the dead of night became unmistakable. Doors would creak open, whispers would fill the air, and you'd catch glimpses of it standing in doorways or peeking around corners, its painted lips curling into a sly grin. Once the doll began walking, there was no escaping it. Lara was a single mother raising her son, Elias, in a modest home on the outskirts of the same cursed forest. The stories of the walking doll were dismissed as folklore, fabrications to keep curious children away from the woods. But Elias, ever the explorer, had a habit of sneaking into forbidden places. One autumn afternoon, he came home clutching something he'd found buried under a pile of leaves near the forest edge, a porcelain doll. Its face was cracked but disturbingly lifelike. One eye was an icy blue, the other clouded as if from cataracts. Its dress, though tattered, bore intricate lace patterns that suggested an era long past. "It was just lying there, Mom," Elias said innocently. "Isn't it cool?" Lara's stomach churned as she held the doll. It felt heavy in her hands, unnaturally so. For reasons she couldn't explain, it made her skin crawl. "This thing is filthy, Elias. We should throw it out," she said. But when she tried to toss it into the trash that evening, she found it sitting on Elias's desk the next morning. "I thought I told you to get rid of it," Lara snapped. Elias shook his head, his face pale. "I didn't bring it back, Mom." The days that followed were a blur of mounting terror. The doll appeared in different places around the house, always closer to one of them. Lara swore she heard faint giggles at night, and more than once, she woke up to find it perched on her nightstand, its unblinking eyes staring directly at her. Then came the footsteps. They started faint, almost imperceptible, as if a mouse was scurrying across the floor. But soon, they grew louder. The click-clack of tiny porcelain feet echoed in the hallways after midnight. Lara would rush out, a flashlight in hand. But she always found nothing. Nothing except the doll, now positioned somewhere impossibly different. One night, as a storm raged outside, Lara awoke to a chilling sound. A rhythmic tapping on her bedroom window. She turned slowly, her pulse hammering in her ears. Standing outside, on the second-story ledge, was the doll, its cracked face pressed against the glass, its lips curved into a grotesque smile. When she screamed, the tapping stopped, but the door to her bedroom creaked open. Lara sat frozen in her bed, her scream swallowed by the thunder roaring outside. The silhouette of the doll in the window was etched in her mind, a grotesque mixture of innocence and malice. The creaking of a bedroom door echoed in the sudden silence, pulling her from her paralysis. "Elias," she called out, her voice trembling. No response, only the steady rhythm of raindrops against the glass and the low groan of the wind. Gripping the flashlight on her nightstand, she swung her legs off the bed and crept toward the open door. The hallway beyond was shrouded in darkness, but she could feel it. Something was there. She clicked on the flashlight, its beam slicing through the shadows. The hallway was empty, but the door to Elias's room was ajar. Elias, she whispered again, louder this time. The sound came again. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't from the window anymore. It was coming from within the house. Summoning her courage, Lara inched forward. Each step felt like walking through quicksand, her legs heavy with fear. The door to Elias's room creaked as she pushed it open. The flashlight's beam danced across his bed, but it was empty. The covers were tossed aside, and his favorite stuffed animal lay discarded on the floor. "Mom," a faint voice called, so soft she wasn't sure if she'd imagined it. "Elias," she whispered, her heart pounding. The voice came again, this time from downstairs. She turned toward the staircase, gripping the banister as she descended, each step groaning under her weight. The living room was bathed in faint light from the storm outside, casting twisted shadows across the walls. The tapping grew louder, accompanied by the faint sound of porcelain scraping against wood. The doll was standing in the center of the room. It wasn't lying limp or lifeless like it should have been. It stood upright, its cracked face angled slightly, as though it was studying her. Its cloudy eye seemed to glisten in the dim light, and its tiny hands clutched something, a small, tattered book. Lara couldn't move. Her mind screamed to run, to grab Elias and flee, but her body was rooted to the spot. "Mom!" Elias's voice came again, this time urgent, panicked. It was coming from the kitchen. Breaking free from a stupor, Lara bolted toward the sound. She found Elias crouched in a corner, his knees drawn to his chest, tears streaming down his face. "It's in here, Mom! It's in here!" he cried. "I saw it, Elias. I saw it in the living room," Lara said, kneeling beside him. "No, Mom," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's not the same one." Lara froze. The realization was like ice water poured over her. Slowly, she turned her head toward the doorway. There, in the dim light of the flickering kitchen bulb, was another doll. This one was smaller, its face even more cracked, its dress frayed to ribbons. Its hands were stained red, and its mouth, a painted curve, now looked more like a sinister sneer. And then the sound began. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't coming from just one place. It came from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. More dolls, dozens of them, began to emerge from the shadows. Each one was unique. Some tall, others short. Some with porcelain faces, others with missing limbs or gouged out eyes. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by an invisible puppeteer. Lara grabbed Elias, pulling him to his feet. "We are leaving. Now!" She dragged him toward the front door, but as they approached, it slammed shut with a deafening asterisk bang star. The dolls encircled them, their tiny feet clicking against the floor in unison. The first doll, the one Elias had brought home, appeared at the center of the circle. It held the tattered book high, opening it with deliberate precision. The pages, yellowed with age, were filled with incomprehensible symbols and drawings. As the doll tilted its head back, a sound like a child's laughter erupted from all around them. But it was warped, distorted, and wrong. The laughter turned into whispers, growing louder and louder until it was deafening. Lara clutched Elias tightly, her mind racing for a way out. One by one, the dolls began to close in, their lifeless eyes glinting with an unnatural light. The first doll reached out a porcelain hand, its fingers cracked but sharp. It touched Lara's arm, and a searing cold spread through her veins, paralyzing her. Elias screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the chorus of whispers. The room spun, the shadows deepened, and then everything went black. When Lara awoke, she was lying on the floor of the living room. The storm had passed, and pale sunlight streamed through the windows. She sat up, her head pounding, and looked around. The house was silent. "Elias," she called, her voice hoarse. There was no answer. Her eyes landed on the doll, the first one. It was sitting on the coffee table, perfectly still. In its lap was the book, now closed. Lara's breath hitched as she noticed something new. The doll's face had changed. Its cracked porcelain features now bore a faint resemblance to someone she knew, Elias. And when she looked closer, she swore its cloudy eye moved, watching her. Lara's chest tightened. her pulse racing as she scrambled to her feet. She stumbled backward, her gaze locked on the doll that now bore her son's likeness. The cracked porcelain, once eerily neutral, seemed almost alive now. Its one intact eye glimmered with something like malice. Or was it anguish? No, she whispered, shaking her head in denial. No, this isn't real. But the surrounding air told a different story. It felt thick and oppressive, as though the house itself was alive, holding her captive. Her eyes darted to the book in the doll's lap. Something about it pulled at her, an inexplicable urge to open it. As if sensing her thoughts, the doll's tiny hand moved, slowly stroking the book's cover. "Where is he?" Lara demanded, her voice cracking. "Where is my son?" The doll didn't answer, of course, but the whispers began again, low, guttural, and echoing from the very walls. The words were indecipherable, but their intent was clear. "Look inside the book." Lara took a shaky step forward, then another, until she was close enough to reach out. Her trembling hands hovered over the ancient tome, and with a deep breath, she flipped it open. The pages were filled with grotesque illustrations. Dolls being pieced together from shattered bodies, shadowy figures standing over crying children, and swirling runes that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Toward the middle of the book, she found a page that stopped her cold. It was a detailed drawing of her son. Elias was depicted perfectly, down to the small scar on his chin from a childhood fall. Around his figure were jagged lines and symbols that seemed to bind him in place. Beneath the drawing, a single phrase was scrawled in bold, black ink. "One must replace another." The room seemed to spin as the meaning sank in. Lara clutched the book, her knuckles white. "No," she hissed through gritted teeth. "I'll get him back." The doll tilted its head slightly, as if mocking her defiance. Its tiny mouth, once just a painted curve, now seemed to twist into a grin. Lara grabbed the book and flung it across the room. It landed with a thud, and for a brief moment, the whispers ceased. But as she turned back to the doll, she saw that it was no longer seated on the table. It was standing. Its tiny porcelain feet clinked softly as it took a single step toward her. Then another. Fueled by desperation, Lara grabbed the nearest object, a heavy glass paperweight, and swung it at the doll. The blow struck true, shattering its head into a dozen pieces. The lifeless body crumpled to the floor. She let out a shaky breath, her relief short-lived. The moment the doll shattered, the house groaned as if in pain, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. The fragments of the doll began to shift and move, crawling across the floor like insects. They reassembled themselves with horrifying speed, and when the doll stood again, its face was no longer cracked. It was whole, and this time, its resemblance to Elias was perfect. Lara screamed and ran for the front door. To her shock, it opened with ease. She bolted into the sunlight, her bare feet slapping against the wet grass as she sprinted toward the woods. But the forest was no sanctuary. The whispers followed her, growing louder with every step. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel them, the dolls, pursuing her, their tiny feet clicking on the ground like a swarm of insects. Lara stumbled and fell into a clearing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers had stopped. For a moment, the only sound was a pounding heartbeat. Then she saw it. At the center of the clearing stood a towering figure, shrouded in shadows. It held a massive, ornate key in one hand and a familiar tattered book in the other. Its face was obscured, but its presence radiated malevolence. "The mother comes to bargain," it said, its voice deep and echoing. Lara swallowed hard, forcing herself to her feet. "Give him back," she demanded, her voice shaking but firm. "Give me my son." The figure tilted its head, mimicking the doll. "A soul for a soul," it intoned. "Will you take his place?" Without hesitation, Lara nodded. "Yes." The figure extended the book toward her. "Sign," it commanded. Her hands trembled as she took the book and flipped to the final page. Her name appeared there, faint and flickering, as if waiting to be completed. A quill appeared in her hand, its tip dripping with dark ink. As she pressed the quill to the page, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The moment she signed her name, the figure let out a terrible laugh, and the ground beneath her feet opened up. Lara screamed as she was swallowed by darkness. Elias woke up in his bed, the morning sun streaming through his window. For a moment, he thought it had all been a terrible dream. But when he turned, he saw the doll sitting on his desk, its painted lips curling into a smile. And in its lifeless hand, it held a strand of his mother's hair.